In the heart of Africa, a quiet revolution is underway, a revolution that no headline has fully captured, and yet its impact could reshape global power for decades. Imagine a continent rich in resources, struggling with infrastructure and debt, suddenly becoming the stage for the world's largest economic chess game, and in the center of it all, China, with a staggering $500 billion plan that could change everything. For decades, Africa has been seen by global powers as a land of opportunity, but also of challenges. Poor infrastructure, political instability, and reliance on foreign aid have made it a battleground not of armies, but of money, influence, and control. And now China has stepped in with an audacious strategy that is equal parts investment, diplomacy, and, some argue, domination. China's approach is not new. Over the past 20 years, it has poured billions into African infrastructure, roads, railways, ports, and energy projects. But what sets this $500 billion plan apart is its scale and its intent. This is not just about building roads, it is about building influence, creating dependency, and securing resources that fuel China's economic engine. The plan covers every corner of the continent, from the oil-rich lands of Nigeria to the mineral-heavy regions of the Democratic Republic of Congo, from East African ports in Kenya to rail networks in Ethiopia. To understand the stakes, you need to understand Africa itself. Africa is home to 1.4 billion people, a growing middle class, and untapped resources that the world desperately needs. Rare earth minerals, cobalt, lithium, these are not just commodities, they are the backbone of the global tech industry. And while the West has historically relied on Africa's resources, it has done so through slow bureaucratic channels, fragmented investments, and often exploitative aid. China, in contrast, comes with a promise of speed, efficiency, and direct deals, no questions asked. The $500 billion plan is structured around three main pillars: infrastructure, energy, and trade networks. The first pillar, infrastructure, involves building or upgrading thousands of kilometers of roads, railways, and ports. The goal is simple, but ambitious: to make Africa more connected internally and externally. For instance, consider the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya, a project funded largely by China. Not only does it reduce transport time from 12 hours to 4, but it also positions Chinese companies at the center of Africa's logistics network. Energy is the second pillar. Africa's power grid is fragmented and unreliable, with millions of people lacking access to electricity. China's investments in solar farms, hydroelectric dams, and power transmission lines are not just about electrifying villages, they are about controlling the flow of energy across the continent. With energy comes leverage. Countries that rely on Chinese-built power infrastructure often find themselves negotiating on China's terms, whether for loans, resource access, or political alignment. The third pillar, trade networks, might be the most strategic of all. China is building trade corridors, industrial zones, and port facilities that not only export African resources to China, but also serve as hubs for Chinese goods and services. This creates a two-way dependency. Africa needs Chinese investment to grow, while China ensures it controls supply chains critical to its domestic economy. Critics call this debt trap diplomacy, and the evidence is hard to ignore. Several African nations have accumulated billions in loans to Chinese banks, and when repayment becomes difficult, China gains unprecedented leverage over national assets. Take the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka as an example. Although not in Africa, it illustrates the strategy. When debt became unsustainable, the port was handed over to Chinese control for 99 years. Africa's leaders are acutely aware of this risk, but the immediate gains, modern infrastructure, investment, and political support, often outweigh long-term concerns. But the story is not black and white.
African countries are not passive players. Some negotiate aggressively with China, leveraging competition from the West, the Gulf states, and India. They seek to balance short-term development needs with long-term sovereignty. However, China's approach is subtle, patient, and strategic. It does not rely on force. It relies on economics, relationships, and a vision that spans decades. The $500 billion plan is not just about economics. It is also about politics. China's Belt and Road Initiative in Africa strengthens political alliances, ensuring that China's voice grows louder in international forums like the United Nations. African votes, once a minor concern in global geopolitics, now carry weight. Every loan, every road, every port contributes to a larger strategy of influence, subtly shifting Africa's alignment on global issues, trade, security, and diplomacy. And yet, there is more than one story here. While critics warn of dependency, others point to unprecedented opportunities, job creation, technology transfer, and improved connectivity that could accelerate Africa's development. But make no mistake, China is playing the long game, and Africa is at the center of a contest that could define the 21st century. So what does this $500 billion plan mean for the rest of the world? For the US, Europe, and even Africa itself, the implications are massive. Control over infrastructure and trade routes could shift economic power balances, and access to resources could secure China's technological edge for decades. In Part 2, we'll dive deeper into how China plans to execute this massive strategy on the ground, including ports, railways, and industrial hubs, and why some analysts believe this could give China unprecedented leverage over African nations for generations to come. When you fly over the eastern coast of Africa, you might notice a quiet transformation. Shipping cranes rise like metal giants in Mombasa, while rail tracks stretch from inland mines to deep-water ports. This is not random development. It is a carefully orchestrated plan, piece by piece, to weave China into the very fabric of Africa's economy. China's $500 billion plan doesn't exist on paper alone. It is happening on the ground, in real time, in cities, villages, and industrial zones. Take Djibouti, a small but strategically vital nation on the Horn of Africa. Here, China has established its first overseas military base, a logistics hub supporting both trade and defense. While the base is small, its symbolism is massive. It signals China's intent not just to invest, but to protect its interests and possibly project power far beyond Africa's shores. Ports are the crown jewels of this strategy. In Kenya, the port of Mombasa has undergone major expansions funded by Chinese banks and executed by Chinese construction firms. In Tanzania, the Bagamoyo port, though controversial, is designed to handle cargo volumes larger than any port in East Africa. These facilities do more than handle goods. They create choke points where China can control shipping logistics, influence trade flows, and secure access to raw materials. Africa's natural resources, from copper to cobalt to rare earth elements, can now move faster, cheaper, and more efficiently to Chinese factories, fueling China's tech and manufacturing boom. Railways are the next piece. Africa's lack of reliable transport has historically been a bottleneck for growth. China is changing that with standard-gauge railways linking inland, resource-rich regions to coastal ports. The Mombasa-Nairobi line in Kenya is just one example, but there are grander ambitions. Rail networks connecting Ethiopia, Djibouti, and even as far as Sudan and Egypt. By controlling the arteries of transport, China gains strategic leverage that goes beyond simple economics. Access and influence in logistics become a form of soft power, binding African economies closer to Beijing's orbit. Then come the industrial hubs. Special economic zones, or SEZs, are being constructed across Africa, where Chinese companies manufacture, process, and export goods. Zambia, Nigeria, and Ethiopia are prime examples. In these zones, Africa's raw materials are transformed into finished products, often under Chinese management and using Chinese technology. Jobs are created, but the real winner is China. It secures processing capabilities near raw materials, reduces shipping costs, and strengthens trade ties. The SEZs also become centers of Chinese culture and
Influence. Schools, housing, and technology training centers follow the factories, creating long-term socio-economic networks. Critics often highlight the debt risks, and for good reason. African governments borrow heavily to fund these projects, often at high interest rates. The logic is simple. If a nation cannot repay, China can negotiate terms favorable to its strategic objectives. Unlike traditional lenders, Beijing does not demand democratic reforms or human rights improvements. It asks for contracts, access, and alignment. For some nations, this is a tempting shortcut to modernization. For others, it is a dangerous gamble. Yet, it is not just debt that shapes influence. It is dependency. Once a country relies on Chinese railways, ports, or power grids, its economic and political decisions begin to reflect Beijing's priorities. For instance, energy projects like hydroelectric dams or solar farms are often tied to Chinese technology and maintenance contracts. If a government wants to expand or upgrade these facilities, it naturally turns to China. Over time, the relationship transforms from transactional to structural, subtly shifting sovereignty without firing a single shot. China also leverages digital infrastructure. Telecom networks, fiber optic cables, and 5G installations often accompany physical projects. African nations gain modern communication capabilities, but China gains influence over digital ecosystems. Data flows, network management, and technology standards increasingly align with Chinese protocols, giving Beijing insight into commerce, governance, and security, all while presenting a facade of partnership and development. And while the West debates tariffs, sanctions, and foreign aid, China acts with patience and precision. Its investments are long-term, low-profile, and strategically placed to yield maximum geopolitical returns. By embedding itself in Africa's transport, energy, industry, and digital systems, China constructs a network of interdependencies that could last decades. Some analysts warn this approach could backfire. Overextension, political instability, or local resistance could derail projects worth billions. Yet China mitigates risk through incremental implementation. Projects start modestly, prove utility, and then expand. By the time local or international critics notice the scale, much of the infrastructure is already operational and difficult to reverse. What makes this strategy particularly sophisticated is its integration of economics, politics, and diplomacy. Every port expansion, railway line, and industrial hub is a chess move. Loans are carefully timed, political alliances nurtured, and trade deals structured to reinforce dependency. The ultimate objective? Not just economic profit, but a durable sphere of influence that positions China as a key power broker in African affairs. By the time the world fully grasps what is happening, China's presence may feel less like investment and more like control. And yet, Africa is not defenseless. Countries are negotiating, recalibrating, and occasionally resisting. But the clock is ticking, and the $500 billion plan is moving forward at a speed few outside Beijing fully understand. In Part 3, we'll uncover the global consequences of this strategy, how it affects U.S. influence, Europe's interests, and the balance of power in international trade. We'll also examine whether Africa can leverage Chinese investment for its own long-term gain, or whether it risks becoming a continent caught in someone else's economic empire. As China's $500 billion plan continues to unfold across Africa, the ripple effects are being felt far beyond the continent. From Washington to Brussels, global powers are watching carefully, and many are quietly worried. Because this is not just about roads, ports, and railways. It is about influence, power, and the shifting balance of power in the 21st century. By now, China is deeply embedded in Africa's infrastructure, energy, trade, and technology networks, but the consequences extend well beyond the continent. For the United States, traditionally the dominant partner in Africa, China's rise presents a challenge to its political and economic influence. Strategic decisions, voting patterns in international forums, and access to critical minerals are all increasingly influenced by Beijing. Africa's alignment on global issues, from climate agreements to trade regulations, can no longer be assumed. Europe faces a similar predicament. European nations have historically invested in Africa through aid programs, development projects, and trade. But slow bureaucratic processes, conditional agreements, and limited infrastructure investment have left a gap. China's speed and scale are attracting African nations that want quick, tangible results. Ports, industrial zones, and railways built in record time create immediate economic benefits, and governments often prefer that over lengthy negotiations or conditional loans from Western institutions. The strategic consequences are profound. Africa controls vast amounts of critical minerals, cobalt for batteries, rare earth elements for electronics, and oil and gas reserves that power industries worldwide. China's ability to secure these resources through infrastructure, loans, and trade agreements gives it a decisive advantage in the global technology and energy race. Simply put, whoever controls Africa's resources gains a competitive edge in the 21st century economy, and China is positioning itself at the front of that line. For Africa, the story is complex. On the one hand, Chinese investment brings unprecedented development, modern ports, efficient railways, energy access, and industrial zones that create jobs and stimulate growth. On the other hand, there are significant risks: debt dependency, political leverage, and potential over-reliance on a single foreign power. The challenge for African leaders is clear: how to extract the benefits of investment without surrendering strategic autonomy. Some countries are attempting a balancing act. Nigeria, Kenya, and Ethiopia, for example, are engaging multiple global partners, leveraging Chinese investment while seeking Western or regional alternatives to prevent overdependence. Others, however, are more vulnerable, and for them, the stakes are existential. Defaulting on loans could mean ceding key infrastructure or access to critical resources. The geopolitical implications are equally staggering. China's strategy in Africa is a microcosm of its broader global ambitions. By establishing long-term economic and political influence on a continent rich in resources and votes, Beijing strengthens its hand in international organizations, trade negotiations, and diplomatic alliances. For the first time in decades, global power dynamics are shifting from the West-centered model toward a multipolar world in which China plays a central role. Military implications can also be neglected. While China's presence is primarily economic, infrastructure and logistics networks have potential strategic value. Ports and railways can support dual-use operations, and the presence of Chinese personnel across Africa increases Beijing's ability to project influence quickly if necessary. This does not mean an immediate conflict, but it does create leverage, a quiet, powerful form of control that few outside Beijing fully appreciate. Yet there is another side to this story. Africa is not a passive chessboard. Local populations, civil society groups, and independent media are increasingly aware of the stakes. Protests over labor conditions, environmental concerns, and corruption linked to Chinese projects have occurred in multiple countries. Digital transparency, social media, and international attention may create checks and balances that Beijing must consider as it expands its footprint. The real question is not whether China can execute its $500 billion plan. That seems certain. But whether the plan will benefit Africa and whether the world can adapt to this new balance of power. Experts argue that Africa has an opportunity to use China's investment strategically. by negotiating stronger contracts, demanding local workforce development, insisting on technology transfers, and maintaining diversified international partnerships, African nations can turn potential dependency into leverage. The continent could emerge stronger, modernized, and more influential on the global stage, rather than simply becoming a satellite of Chinese economic power. For viewers outside Africa, this matters in very tangible ways. Global supply chains for electronics, energy security, trade policies, and even climate initiatives are increasingly intertwined with China's Africa strategy. A factory in Shenzhen producing electric vehicles relies on cobalt mined in the DRC, transported via Chinese-built railways to a port, and shipped across the world. The world is more interconnected than ever before,
And China's footprint in Africa ensures it will be a central player in global decision-making for decades. Finally, what can we expect in the coming years? Africa will continue to modernize rapidly, driven largely by Chinese investment. Competition among global powers will intensify as the US, Europe, and India look to maintain influence. Political, economic, and technological leverage will shift toward nations that act strategically and quickly. And China? Its patient, long-term, and multifaceted approach is likely to secure it a dominant position in Africa, unless unforeseen crises, local resistance, or geopolitical shifts intervene. The $500 billion plan is more than a series of projects. It is a blueprint for the future of Africa, and perhaps the world. Roads, ports, railways, and energy grids may seem like infrastructure, but in reality, they are the threads of power weaving China's influence into every corner of a continent that has never been more important. As the sun sets over the African plains, the cranes and ports continue their work, the rails stretch farther inland, and factories hum with activity. China's plan is in motion, and the world is only beginning to understand its scale, its implications, and the potential to reshape global power for generations to come. The question is no longer if China is investing in Africa. The question is, who will control the story of Africa's future, and what will that mean for the balance of power in the 21st century?